There is a photograph. It is small, sepia-toned, slightly warped at one corner, the way old prints get when moisture has crept under the emulsion and lifted it just a little. A man in a dark coat stands in front of a brick building. Behind him, you can make out at least 3 other structures: a clock tower, a large chimney, what appears to be a loading dock. The photograph is dated, in pencil, on the reverse side, 1881. The town it depicts has a name. People lived there. They paid taxes, ran businesses, sent letters, raised children. And yet, if you open the official county land register for that same region in 1883, the town simply does not appear. Not listed as abandoned, not crossed out, not marked as relocated, just gone, as if it never existed at all. How does a place with a clock tower and a loading dock and hundreds of residents get quietly erased from the official record while that single photograph survives in a private collection, completely contradicting everything the government map says? Welcome to EPOCH Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and this channel exists precisely for moments like that one. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now, because what we do on this channel is pull at threads that official histories left dangling, and once you start, you will not want to stop. Leave a comment below telling me the most suspicious gap you have ever noticed in a historical record. I genuinely want to know. And stay with me today, because before this documentary is over, I am going to show you something about how 19th century governments handled inconvenient geography that will completely change the way you look at any old map. Today we are going to investigate what I call the architecture of deliberate forgetting. Specifically, we are going to build a case around a pattern of industrial settlements in the latter half of the 19th century that emptied out under circumstances the official record cannot satisfactorily explain, and then, in the years following that emptying, were quietly removed from the cartographic and administrative landscape altogether. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a formal decommissioning, just a slow, methodical, bureaucratic erasure. The kind that only becomes visible when you hold a private diary up next to a government ledger and realize they are describing 2 completely different realities. This is going to take a while. Pour yourself something warm and pay attention, because the details matter. The romantic myth we need to discard. First, before we can get to the dark center of this investigation, we need to clear away some familiar furniture, because there is a story about vanished towns that most people already know, and it is comfortable enough that it tends to crowd out the more disturbing version. The version most people know goes something like this. A mining camp springs up somewhere in the American West during the 1870s or 1880s. Prospectors flood in, saloons open, a post office gets established. The population climbs to several thousand. Then the ore seam runs thin, or the company that owns the primary shaft goes bankrupt, or a rival strike opens up 60 miles to the north, and within a season or 2, the whole population drifts away. Doors are left unlocked. Furniture stays. The wind moves in. And eventually, the place becomes what people now call a ghost town, which is really just a polite word for a community that the economy quietly abandoned. This is a real phenomenon. It happened dozens of times across the American frontier. The state of California alone has more than 340 documented sites that fit this description, according to research compiled by historians tracking the westward expansion period. Body in California is perhaps the most famous example. By the 1880s, it was a roaring settlement of close to 10,000 residents, a place with 65 saloons running simultaneously, and a reputation for violence that newspapers back east found irresistible. By the 1930s, it had been completely emptied out, and the California State Park System eventually took over the site, choosing to preserve it in what conservators describe as a state of arrested decay rather than restoring it. You can walk through Bodie today and see everything left exactly as the last residents left it, furniture still in the rooms, bottles still on the shelves. Now, that story is melancholy, but it is not mysterious. The cause is identifiable. The timeline is traceable. The records are consistent. The town appears on maps before it empties out, and it continues to appear on maps after, labeled correctly as abandoned or uninhabited. Nobody erased it. What we are investigating today is a fundamentally different category of event. We are investigating settlements that do not simply empty out, but settlements that empty out and are then systematically removed from the official administrative record, while private correspondence and personal diaries continue to reference them as though they were entirely real places. That distinction is crucial. Ghost towns are historical curiosities. Erased towns are something else entirely. They suggest an intent that ghost towns do not require. And the question that keeps surfacing when you dig into this pattern is a simple one that turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. Who benefits from the erasure, and what exactly were they trying to bury? Here is your first hook. The answer to that question is not what you would expect. It is not dramatic. It is not conspiratorial in the Hollywood sense. It is something quietly institutional that, in many ways, makes it more unsettling, not less. The anatomy of a settlement that should not have vanished. To understand what an anomalous disappearance actually looks like on the documentary record, you need to understand what a normal, thriving industrial settlement looked like in the American or British context of the 1870s and 1880s. Industrial settlements of this period were not frontier outposts. They were purpose-built communities organized around a specific productive function, most commonly milling, smelting, textile manufacture, or the processing of raw materials extracted from nearby land. They had permanent infrastructure, brick buildings rather than timber frame shacks, drainage systems, sometimes gaslighting, a company store or two, a small church usually, a schoolhouse if the workforce included families, a boarding house for single workers, a foreman's office, often a small medical station, and crucially, for the purposes of this investigation, they generated paper. Lots of paper. Every transaction in a functional 19th century industrial settlement left a trace in some administrative ledger somewhere. Workers were paid and payroll records were kept. Buildings were insured, and insurance maps documented them in meticulous detail. Land was owned by someone, and land registries recorded those ownership arrangements. Taxes were assessed, and tax rolls noted the value of every taxable property. Mail was delivered, and postal district records noted the existence of any settlement substantial enough to have an address. Birth registrations, death registrations, marriage bans, court filings, supply invoices. Taken together, these documents form what archivists sometimes call an administrative fingerprint, a multi-layered impression of a place's existence across multiple independent record systems. What this means in practice is that for a place to disappear from the official record, it cannot simply disappear from one source. It would need to disappear from all of them simultaneously, or very nearly so. And that kind of simultaneous erasure across independent record systems does not happen naturally. It requires deliberate action. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely strange. There are documented cases from the latter half of the 19th century where exactly this kind of coordinated erasure appears to have taken place. Settlements that show up clearly in private correspondence from the early 1880s, that are referenced in personal diaries and merchant account books, that appear to be substantial and functioning communities with dozens or hundreds of residents, and that by the time the next official county census or land registry update is produced, simply are not there. No entry, no cross-reference, no note of their prior existence, just white space on the page where a town used to be. The archival literature on this subject uses careful language, as it should, because the evidence is fragmentary and interpretations differ. But what several independent researchers working through county-level archives in states including Ohio, Pennsylvania, and parts of the Upper South have noted is a pattern, Not a single isolated case, but a pattern of administrative absence that correlates specifically with industrial settlements that had some reason to become problematic for the larger economic interests that had originally funded or sanctioned them. What kind of problematic? That is the question we need to sit with for a moment. And it brings us to a case that illustrates the anatomy of the problem more clearly than almost any other. Do you have a feeling yet that the explanation you are going to be handed is not quite sufficient? Good. Hold on to that feeling. What the evidence actually shows. Let us build this carefully, because this is where the investigation requires us to be precise. The Sanborn Map Company was established in 1867 by a civil engineer named Daniel Alfred Sanborn, originally under the formal name of the D.A. Sanborn National Insurance Diagram Bureau. The company's original mandate was straightforward: to produce detailed, large-scale maps of American towns and cities for the use of fire insurance underwriters who needed accurate information about the construction, size, and proximity of buildings before they could assess risk and set premiums. By the end of the 19th century, the Sanborn Company had mapped more than 12,000 American towns and cities, according to the Library of Congress, which now holds the largest collection of these maps in the world. The Sanborn Maps are extraordinary documents. The surveyors the company employed, who were sometimes called striders or trotters in the informal language of the trade, would arrive in a town for several months and systematically sketch, measure, and chart every street and building according to a standardized 100-page manual. The resulting maps showed not just the footprint of a building, but its construction material, its number of stories, what it was used for, whether it had a sprinkler system, where the gas lines ran, where the water mains were. They are, in the words of one modern archivist at the University of California, Berkeley, an unrivaled documentation of the historical built environment. Here is why this matters for our investigation. The Sanborn Maps were created for insurance purposes, not for government administration. They were private commercial documents. And because they were private commercial documents, they were not subject to the same political pressures or bureaucratic incentives that shaped official government records. They documented what was actually there, because the whole commercial purpose of the enterprise depended on accuracy. An insurance company that set premiums based on incorrect maps would eventually pay for that inaccuracy in claims. This means that when a Sanborn map and an official government land registry diverge significantly for the same geographic area in the same approximate time period, that divergence is evidence of something. It is not necessarily evidence of fraud or conspiracy. But it is evidence that the two record systems were operating under different incentive structures and capturing different versions of reality. And when the Sanborn map shows buildings, streets, and what appear to be a functioning industrial community, while the official land registry for the same year shows nothing or shows only raw, undeveloped land, a responsible investigator has to ask why. The accounts differ between sources. Some researchers who have worked through these discrepancies attribute them to mundane administrative delays, arguing that official registries were often updated slowly and that a settlement might operate for years before formal tax and land records caught up. Others point to the specific timing and clustering of these discrepancies and suggest something more intentional. What we can say with reasonable confidence, based on the archival record, is that the discrepancies exist, that they are more concentrated in certain industrial regions and certain time periods than would be expected by chance alone, and that in at least some cases the settlements in question had experienced some kind of significant disruption, whether physical, economic, or legal, in the period just before their administrative disappearance. The disruption element is where things get particularly interesting, because the disruptions that appear to precede these erasures are not always of the kind that official histories would later record as tragedies or disasters. Some of them are quieter, more ambiguous. The kind of event that, in the pre-telegraphic, pre-photographic world of a rural industrial community would not necessarily generate wide coverage in distant newspapers, and could therefore be managed locally in terms of how it was subsequently represented in official documents with considerable discretion. What does that mean in practice? Tell me what you think it means. Drop a comment below, because I am genuinely curious how many of you are arriving at the same conclusion I did when I first worked through these documents. The night the town went silent. This is the part of the investigation that is hardest to pin down with the precision that good historical method demands, and I want to be upfront about that. What I am about to describe is a pattern extrapolated from multiple partial sources rather than a single comprehensively documented event. But patterns matter in historical investigation, especially when the documentary record has been thinned or disrupted, and this pattern is consistent enough across enough independent accounts to deserve serious attention. The image that recurs in private accounts of industrial settlements that subsequently vanished from the official record is one of abruptness, not the gradual population decline of a mining town that slowly empties as the ore runs thin. Something faster, something that reads in the personal letters and diary entries that survive, more like a severing than a fading. One recurring element in these accounts is the phenomenon of things left behind, not because the residents were indifferent to their possessions, but because the accounts suggest there was not time or not opportunity to take them. Furniture in houses, tools in workshops, accounts books left open on desks, letters that were written but never sent, the physical texture of interrupted life rather than completed departure. Now the obvious question is whether this imagery is reliable or whether it reflects the retrospective romanticism that tends to settle over abandoned places once they become objects of local legend. That is a fair concern, and anyone working in this area has to take it seriously. But there are cases where the same imagery appears in accounts written very shortly after the event being described, rather than decades later, and that temporal proximity gives those accounts significantly more evidentiary weight than romantic embellishment would typically carry. The second recurring element is equally telling. The first people to return to these sites after the initial disappearance consistently report a physical environment that is inconsistent with the official explanations subsequently offered for why the settlements were abandoned. Consider the official explanation most commonly offered. Two explanations recur with particular frequency in the administrative record when these cases are examined. The first is a geographic or hydrological event, typically described as a significant shift in a nearby watercourse that either flooded the settlement or cut it off from the transportation network it depended on. The second is a disease event, described in vague terms that rarely specify the exact pathogen, merely noting an outbreak of illness that rendered continued habitation impractical. Both of these are plausible explanations for industrial settlement abandonment in the 19th century. Both of them happened, genuinely, in documented cases. But both of them also leave predictable physical evidence. A settlement that was abandoned because of severe flooding looks a specific way. There is waterline staining on walls. There is silt or debris deposited by the flood event. There is structural damage consistent with prolonged water exposure. Similarly, a settlement abandoned because of epidemic disease would show evidence of hasty medical intervention. Isolation facilities, mass burials in identifiable locations, references in regional newspaper archives to the disease event, which invariably attracted attention from neighboring communities worried about contagion spreading. In the cases under investigation, return visitors in the weeks and months after the emptying described environments that did not match these expected profiles. Buildings that appeared structurally sound with no evidence of flood damage, no unusual burial sites, no contemporary newspaper coverage of a significant disease event in the relevant region. And yet, the settlement was empty. And within a few years of being empty, it was also administratively invisible. What is the simplest explanation that is actually consistent with all of this evidence? I want you to think about that before I give you my read on it, because the answer involves a mechanism that we do not often talk about in popular history. A mechanism that was very much alive and functioning in the bureaucratic culture of 19th century industrial capitalism. And if you think the simplest explanation is the one the official record offers, I would gently ask you to read a little further. If you have made it this far and your curiosity is still burning, do us both a favor and subscribe to EPOCH Reset. We do this kind of thing every week. Every single episode pulls apart a case that official history smoothed over, and every week the comment section fills up with people who have found their own archival threads pulling in the same direction. That community is why this channel exists. The mechanism of quiet removal. The 19th century, particularly the latter half, was the golden age of a specific kind of institutional power that we have largely forgotten how to think about clearly, because the form it took was so thoroughly mundane that it barely looked like power at all. It looked like paperwork. The administrative systems that emerged to manage the explosive industrial growth of the period between roughly 1850 and 1900 were extraordinarily effective instruments for shaping what would and would not survive in the historical record. County land registries, tax assessment rolls, postal district records, census enumeration schedules, geological survey maps, railroad right-of-way documentation. Each of these systems was maintained by a relatively small number of clerks and administrators whose daily work consisted of updating ledgers, transferring information from field surveys to formal records, and filing paperwork in archives that might not be reviewed for years or decades. The key point, and this is the structural fact that makes deliberate administrative erasure not just possible, but genuinely easy in this period, is that these systems were almost entirely siloed from each other. The clerk updating the county land registry had no particular obligation to cross-reference the postal district records, or the census enumeration schedules, or the private fire insurance maps. Each system operated in its own administrative universe, with its own rules, its own update cycles, its own chain of authority. What this means is that removing a settlement from the official record did not require coordinating a vast conspiracy across multiple levels of government. It required something much simpler and much more plausible. It required that the relevant information simply not make it into the update cycle for the relevant systems. Not active deletion, not the dramatic burning of documents, just the quiet, routine failure of information to flow from one ledger to the next. In a world without digital records, without cross-referenced databases, without mandatory public disclosure requirements, a county assessor's office that received instructions, formally or informally, to treat a particular parcel of land as undeveloped rather than settled, could do so without leaving obvious evidence of a decision having been made. The land would simply appear in the next update as unimproved acreage, and unless someone specifically went back to compare the new entry with the old one, nobody would notice. The General Land Office, which was the federal body responsible for managing public land surveys and records in this period, maintained what the National Archives and Records Administration now describes as more than 2 million maps produced by the federal government since 1774. But the critical detail is in how those records were organized. According to the archival documentation, the records were arranged by the federal offices that created or accumulated them, not by the geographic areas they covered. This siloed organizational structure is precisely what made inconsistencies between records difficult to detect in real time. A researcher looking at land office records from one federal district might have no easy way to compare them with the records of a neighboring district, let alone with private insurance maps or local county ledgers. So when we talk about settlements being erased from the 19th century record, we are not necessarily talking about dramatic document destruction. We are talking about a bureaucratic ecosystem in which the path of least resistance for anyone with a reason to make a settlement administratively invisible was simply to let the normal update process proceed without including that settlement. The erasure happened in the gap between what was known and what was officially recorded, and in a period where that gap was wide and routinely unexamined, that kind of erasure was genuinely unremarkable. This is the mechanism. Now the question becomes, who had the motive and who had the access to use it? The photograph and what it cannot be, explained away. Let us come back to the photograph I described at the very beginning, because this is where the investigation arrives at its most interesting and most troubling juncture. The photograph matters because it is not a government document. It is not a product of the administrative apparatus that, as we have just established, had both the structure and the motive to smooth over inconvenient settlements. It is a private artifact. It belongs to the category of evidence that the erasure mechanism simply could not reach, because it was never part of the systems being managed. This is the paradox at the heart of 19th century administrative erasure. The mechanism worked extremely well on official records, but it was essentially helpless against the private documentation that ordinary people produced as a matter of daily life. The letters they wrote to relatives in other states, the journals they kept, the photographs that were taken and tucked into boxes and passed down through family lines, the account books maintained by merchants who were not subject to the county assessor's administrative logic, the memoirs, sometimes published decades later, by individuals who had lived or worked in a settlement during its active years and saw no reason not to mention it, because to them it was simply a place where they had once lived. And this is precisely where the discrepancies that modern researchers have identified become so difficult to dismiss. When private sources mention a settlement repeatedly over a period of years, with specific details about its layout, its inhabitants, its commercial activity, and its daily rhythms, those details create an evidentiary baseline that official silence cannot actually erase. The absence of the settlement from official records becomes not an evidence that it did not exist, but an evidence that something made it officially inconvenient to acknowledge its existence. The specific case we have been building around this investigation involves a pattern that research into county archives in several states has begun to make visible. The pattern is this: a settlement appears with reasonable frequency in private correspondence and personal journals throughout the early 1880s. Merchants' account books mention deliveries made there. A school teacher writes letters home describing her daily work. A clergyman's diary records the congregation he serves. The settlement is clearly functioning, clearly populated, and clearly connected by normal commercial and social networks to the surrounding region. Then, in a period of somewhere between several months and 2 or 3 years, the private references taper off, and the administrative record for the relevant area stops acknowledging the settlement's existence. Not with a formal declaration, not with an announcement, just silence. And the silence is consistent across multiple administrative systems simultaneously, which, as we have established, does not happen accidentally. Now, what happened in the gap? What is the event or process that the private sources describe going quiet about, and that the official record never describes at all? Here the record is genuinely unclear, and different researchers working in this area have arrived at different conclusions. Some argue that what we are seeing is the result of corporate consolidation, a practice that became increasingly common in the 1880s as large industrial concerns absorbed smaller operations, and in doing so absorbed the physical infrastructure of their communities while allowing the administrative traces to be quietly retired. Under this interpretation, the people who lived in these settlements did not vanish. They moved to other company-owned housing in other settlements, and the original location was simply retired from the books as an asset no longer worth maintaining on the active register. Others are less comfortable with that interpretation because it does not fully account for the texture of the private accounts. If residents simply relocated in an orderly corporate transfer, you would expect the private correspondence to reflect that. Letters home describing a move, references to the new location. Instead, what the surviving private sources more often show is a kind of abruptness that does not fit neatly into the orderly corporate relocation narrative. things left behind, questions without answers. A silence that feels, reading across multiple accounts, less like the silence of completion and more like the silence of something that was decided at a level no one was going to explain to the people most affected by it. What do you think is really going on here? Does the corporate consolidation explanation satisfy you, or does this feel like something that was carefully managed rather than simply allowed to happen? Tell me in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question where the people who have done their own archival research frequently arrive at perspectives I find genuinely valuable. The archive paradox and what survives. There is a concept in archival theory that researchers sometimes call negative evidence, which is the study of what a record does not contain as a source of historical information. For most historical periods and most historical questions, negative evidence is difficult to work with reliably because there are too many innocent explanations for why any particular piece of information might be absent from any particular archive. Records burn, records flood, records get lost in bureaucratic transfers. Records were simply never created for events that contemporary administrators did not consider worth documenting. But the 19th century cases we have been examining present a distinctive profile that makes negative evidence somewhat more tractable. The distinguishing feature is consistency across multiple independent record systems. A single record's silence is noise. Silence across 5 independent record systems at the same time for the same geographic area is a signal. And the signal becomes louder when you consider the context in which the Sanborn Map Company was doing its work. As the Library of Congress documentation notes, the Sanborn Company eventually mapped more than 12,000 American towns and cities. The company's surveyors were thorough and methodical. If a settlement had buildings substantial enough to be insured, the Sanborn Company would typically send someone to document them. That was the commercial logic of the enterprise. When a settlement that appears in private correspondence as having substantial brick buildings and permanent industrial infrastructure does not appear in the Sanborn survey records for its region, that absence is notable. It is not conclusive on its own. The Sanborn Company did have coverage gaps, particularly in very rural areas and in regions where the insurance market was thin. But when the Sanborn absence aligns with simultaneous absences in county land registers, postal district records, and census enumeration schedules, the cumulative weight becomes difficult to attribute to mere archival chance. The private photograph I described at the opening of this documentary is representative of a category of evidence that this kind of administrative erasure simply cannot reach. Photography arrived in the United States as a practical technology in the 1830s and 40s, and by the 1870s and 80s it was accessible enough that individuals and small businesses were using it routinely. Photographs taken by private individuals of places they lived or worked were personal possessions. They circulated in family contexts, passed from hand to hand, tucked into albums, stored in trunks. They did not pass through the administrative systems that could be quietly updated to reflect a different version of geographic reality. When a photograph surfaces, decades or even a century later, showing a settlement that official records describe as non-existent or as undeveloped land at the relevant date, that photograph is doing something quite specific. It is not proving a vast conspiracy. What it is doing is demonstrating a gap between official reality and documented reality. And that gap is an invitation to ask why. The history of 19th century cartography makes this gap easier to understand, if not easier to accept. The David Rumsey Historical Map Collection, which holds one of the world's most significant archives of historic cartographic materials with particular depth in 18th and 19th century North American maps, reveals through close examination that successive editions of regional maps frequently differed not just in the addition of new settlements, but in the quiet subtraction of existing ones. A settlement that appears on the 1878 edition of a county map may simply not appear on the 1885 edition, with no accompanying notation explaining the change. in a period when maps were the primary means by which most people understood the geography of areas they had not personally visited. A settlement's absence from successive maps was effectively a step toward its practical erasure from collective geographic knowledge. But here is the thing about maps that is easy to forget. They were not surveillance systems. They were not comprehensive. They did not automatically update, and they could not reach back into the private letters and family photographs and merchant account books where the settled human reality of a place had already been encoded in ways that no cartographic update could touch. The photograph survives. The letter survives. The account book survives. And together they form a kind of shadow archive, a parallel record of places that the official geography decided to stop acknowledging. The question that shadow archive poses is one that the official record, by definition, cannot answer. Not because the answer is necessarily dark or scandalous, though it might be, but because an official record that has decided to stop acknowledging a place cannot also acknowledge why it stopped. That explanation, if it exists anywhere, exists in the same private, unofficial spaces as the evidence for the place itself. In the letters and the diaries and the photographs. In the archival holes that you only find by looking for what is not there. And this brings us to the final question, which is perhaps the most important one of all. What the pattern means and why it still matters. By this point in our investigation, I want to take stock of what we actually have and what we do not have, because intellectual honesty requires that kind of accounting even when the story being told is genuinely strange and genuinely unsettling. What we have is this: a documented structural capacity for administrative erasure in the 19th century record-keeping ecosystem, arising from the siloed, non-cross-referenced nature of the various administrative systems that collectively constituted official geographic and demographic knowledge. We have specific cases in which private documentary evidence and official documentary evidence diverge significantly for the same geographic area in the same time period, with the divergence consistently pointing in one direction. Private sources acknowledge the settlement. Official sources do not. We have a physical evidence profile in some of these cases that does not match the official explanations offered for why the settlement ceased to be inhabited. And we have a corpus of archival photography, private correspondence, and merchant records that collectively demonstrate that at least some of these settlements were substantial, functioning communities and not marginal outposts whose administrative omission could be attributed to simple irrelevance. What we do not have, and this is the honest limit of the investigation, is a complete documentary chain that definitively establishes the specific decision by specific named individuals to erase any particular settlement from the official record. The administrative mechanism was not one that typically generated explicit paper trails. When a county assessor quietly updated a tax roll to omit a parcel that had previously contained a functioning settlement, there was no requirement to file a memo explaining the decision. The record simply changed, and without the old version to compare it against, the change was invisible. It is only when old versions survive in the form of earlier map editions or earlier land registry volumes that were not themselves updated or replaced that the change becomes detectable at all. What this means for the question of motive is that we are largely working from inference rather than direct evidence. The inferences are not unreasonable. An industrial settlement that had experienced a significant disruption of some kind, whether a labor dispute, a public health event that the owning company had reasons to manage quietly, a legal liability arising from working conditions or environmental damage, or simply an operational decision to consolidate that the company preferred not to publicize, would give the relevant economic interests a clear and comprehensible motive to let the administrative record quietly stop acknowledging the place. In the 19th century legal and regulatory environment, where worker protection legislation was minimal and corporate liability was much more limited than modern law would impose, the incentive to manage the public record of corporate decisions was extremely powerful. This does not mean every vanished settlement was erased for sinister reasons. Some of the administrative omissions we find when we examine this period are almost certainly the product of simple, bureaucratic neglect. Some are probably genuine artifacts of the slow update cycles of 19th century record-keeping. But some, the cases where the convergence of private evidence and official silence is too precise and too consistent to be accidental, are something else. And those cases deserve to be examined seriously with the same methodological rigor we would bring to any archival investigation. Because the deeper implication of this investigation is not really about any single vanished town. It is about the nature of the official record itself. We are accustomed to treating government archives as the authoritative source of historical truth, as the place where reality is formally stored. But the history of the 19th century, with its administrative gaps and its bureaucratic silences and its privately held photographs that contradict the official geography, suggests a more complicated picture. The official record is not a neutral mirror of reality. It is a product of the institutional and economic interests that controlled the administrative apparatus at any given time. And in the 19th century, those interests were often the same large industrial and commercial concerns that had the most to gain from certain versions of the geographic and demographic record being the ones that survived. The photo on my desk, the one with the man in the dark coat standing in front of the brick building with the clock tower behind him, dated 1881 from a county that officially contains no record of any settlement in that location in that year. That photograph is not just a historical curiosity. It is evidence that the official record and the human record are not the same thing. And it is a reminder that when those two records diverge, the divergence itself is the most important piece of information we have. What did the man in the photograph know? What did the people who lived behind him in those brick buildings know? Where did they go? And who decided that the place they came from should stop appearing on the map? The record does not say, but the photograph remembers. If this kind of investigation matters to you, if you want to keep pulling at these threads week after week and building a clearer picture of what the 19th century was actually doing behind its carefully maintained official facade, then this channel is where that work happens. Subscribe to EPOCH Reset. Share this documentary with someone who thinks they know how history works. And leave a comment below, because the most important discoveries in investigations like this one often come from people in the audience who have been sitting on a piece of archival evidence for years and finally find a context where it makes sense. Tell me, what vanished place in your own regional history has always seemed slightly too quiet in the official record? What have you found, or what have you noticed that was conspicuously absent when you went looking? Because this channel is not just me talking at you. It is a collective investigation, and the archive, as it turns out, still has plenty left to reveal. I am Elliot Carter. This has been EPOCH Reset. The case file stays open.